The blizzard came on the 3rd day of February. Everyone in the Powder River Valley knew it was coming because the sky on the 1st of February had the color and quality of a sky that was finished with warnings. The temperature had dropped 14 degrees between sunrise and noon with no wind, which was the specific sequence that the old-timers in the valley recognized as the pause before the main event, the moment when a Montana winter finished inhaling before it said what it had to say. By the morning of the 2nd day, the families in the valley had done what families did before a blizzard. They brought the animals in, stacked the wood tight against the cabin walls, checked the door hinges, added weight to the roof if they had boards to spare, and then went inside and waited. One family did not do these things. The Brauer family, Heinrich Brauer, his wife Martha, his 2 sons Karl and Franz, brought the animals in on the 1st of February and stacked their wood, and then did the additional thing that their situation required, the thing that made them different from the other families in the valley. They sent the oldest boy, Karl, 17, on the black horse up the Eastern Canyon Trail with a bundle of food and a look on his face that he had been wearing since October. He rode 2 miles up the canyon to the ledge above Crow Creek, where the basalt cliff ran for 40 yards along the south wall, and where, set back in the cliff face behind a timber frame and a split-pole door, the smoke of a small fire curled up the canyon wall into the February sky. He called out before he dismounted. He always called out. He had learned to call out. The door opened and a woman looked out at him. Her name was Dorothea Schreiber. She was 44 years old, German, and she had been in the Powder River country since 1856, first with her husband Werner, and then, after Werner died in September of 1858, alone. She had a daughter named Hannah who was 11, and she had what she had built in the basalt cave above Crow Creek since the week after Werner died, and the Brauer family told her, with the specific regret of people who had made a difficult decision, that the arrangements were changing. She looked at Karl. She looked at the bundle. She said, "Come in." He came in, and he set the bundle on the table that was a timber slab on 2 stone legs, and he looked at the fire in the hearth and at the wall behind the hearth, and at the temperature in the room, which was warm in a way that he had not been certain it would be warm each time he came, and would not be certain of next time. And he said, "There is a blizzard coming." She said, "I know." He said, "My father says to ask if you need anything." She looked at him. She was a woman who had been looking at the Brauer family for 4 months with a particular clarity. The clarity that comes from being given clarity you did not ask for. And what she saw in Karl Brauer's face was not his father's face. It was a 17-year-old boy who had been sent on errands all autumn and winter with the bundle of food and the look, and who had been coming up the canyon trail and calling out before he dismounted, because he wanted to make sure she heard him coming. She said, "We have what we need." He said, "The blizzard will last 2 days. Maybe 3. She said, "I know." He said, "The temperature will go to -30, maybe lower." She looked at the wall behind the hearth. She said, "Then we will find out what this wall can do at -30. He looked at the wall. He had pressed his hand to it every time he came up the canyon. Since October, the way you pressed your hand to a thing you were not sure of, testing it each time against the hope that it would still be there. The wall was warm. It was always warm. He understood why it was warm, in the way a 17-year-old understood things that adults had explained to him, which was partly and with questions still underneath. He said, "I want to stay." She looked at him. He said, "For the blizzard. I want to be here when it comes." He said it plainly, without asking permission, which was the kind of thing that had been arriving in him since October, along with the other changes of 17. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Heinrich Brauer and what he had said in October, and she thought about what Karl Brauer standing here saying, "I want to stay," meant. And she thought about Hannah, who was 11 and who had been asking questions about Karl Brauer since September. She said, "Your father will wonder where you are." He said, "I left a note." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down." He sat down. This is the story of what Dorothea Schreiber built in the basalt cave above Crow Creek in the autumn and winter of 1858, and what the blizzard of February 1859 found when it arrived. Werner Schreiber had come to the Powder River country from Ohio in 1856 with his wife, his daughter, and a specific plan. The plan was cattle, not the grand cattle plan of men who arrived with capital and bought range by the section. The small cattle plan of a man with enough money for a breeding pair and enough land for a herd that would grow over years into something worth having. He had 40 acres on the creek bottom, a cabin he and Heinrich Brauer had built together in the first summer, and a partnership with Heinrich that was the informal partnership of neighboring men on the frontier, the shared labor and shared intelligence that was not written down, because writing it down would have implied it could be dissolved. Werner had the gift for cattle that some men had, the ability to read an animal's condition by watching it move, to know when to breed and when to cull, to make the decisions that compounded over seasons into a herd that was worth more than the sum of its parts. In 2 years, the breeding pair had become 8 animals, and the 8 were becoming 12, and the plan was proceeding at exactly the rate Werner had expected it to proceed when he made the plan in Ohio. He died of blood poisoning in September of 1858. A wire cut on his right hand that he had not treated properly because the treatment would have meant stopping work for 3 days, and the work was not at a point where it could stop. By the time the hand was bad enough that stopping was mandatory, stopping was not enough. The infection had moved up his arm and into his blood, and the frontier medicine available in the Powder River Valley in 1858 was not medicine that could address this efficiently. He knew for 4 days that he was dying. He used the 4 days to tell Dorothea what she needed to know, which was a great deal of what he had been carrying in his head for 2 years, about the herd and the land and the money and the agreements. She listened to all of it. She had been listening to Werner for 12 years, and she was good at it. On the 4th day, he told her about the agreement with Heinrich Brauer. The agreement was not written down. He had trusted Heinrich Brauer for 2 years, and this had been a reasonable thing to trust. But the agreement being unwritten now had a different quality than it had when Werner was alive to enforce it with his presence. The agreement was that in the event of Werner's death, the herd would be managed jointly by Dorothea and Heinrich until Hannah was of age, and then the herd would pass to Hannah. In exchange, Heinrich would take 1/3 of the annual increase. Werner said, "Heinrich is a fair man." Then he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "But he has 2 sons and no daughters and a wife who thinks ahead." Dorothea said, "I know." He said, "Get the agreement in writing if you can." She said, "I will try." He died the following morning. She tried. She went to Heinrich Brauer 3 days after the burial, still wearing the black she would wear for a year, and she said she wanted the agreement about the herd written down. Heinrich looked at her across his kitchen table, and he said he thought written agreements between neighbors suggested a lack of trust, and that he had trusted Werner, and he trusted her, and he did not see the need. She said, "Werner wanted it written." He looked at her. She could see him doing the calculation that Werner had warned her about, the one that involved 2 sons and no daughters, and a wife who thought ahead. She could see the calculation reaching its conclusion. He said, "Werner is gone, and I am sorry for it. He was a good man and a good neighbor, but the arrangement was between him and me, and it cannot simply be transferred to a wife as if nothing has changed. The situation has changed." He paused. "I will continue to manage the herd through the winter. In the spring, we can discuss what a fair arrangement looks like going forward." She said, "And the cabin." He said, "The cabin is on my land." This was the part Werner had not fully explained to her, because Werner had assumed he would be there to manage what it meant. The cabin was on the east 40 of Heinrich Brauer's land claim, not on the creek bottom 40 that Werner had filed on. Werner had built it there because the east 40 had a spring, and the creek bottom 40 flooded in spring runoff, and building on the creek bottom was building something that would require rebuilding. He had built on Heinrich's land with Heinrich's permission and the informal agreement of neighbors who expected to be neighbors for a long time. She said, "Werner built that cabin." He said, "Werner built it on my land with my permission." He is gone, and the permission was his, not transferable. She paused. He was not a cruel man. He said, "I will not put you out before spring." He said this with the voice of a man making a concession that he believed was generous. She understood that before spring meant she had perhaps 6 months, and that the herd would be Heinrich's by spring, regardless of what she did. Because the herd was on Heinrich's land, and she was on Heinrich's land, and an unwritten agreement with a dead man was what it was. She looked at Heinrich Brauer and she said, "I will be out before winter." He said, "There is no need to be hasty." She said, "I will be out before winter." She said it the second time, the same way she said it the first time, evenly, without the inflection that would have made it dramatic, because it was not dramatic. It was a decision. She stood up and went back to the cabin. She had 6 weeks before winter. She spent the first 3 days after the conversation walking the land she did have access to, the creek bottom 40 that Werner had filed on, which was hers in the legal sense that frontier land was yours when you had filed on it. The creek bottom was exactly what Werner had known it was. Good grass for cattle, good water access, bad for building. The spring runoff flooded 3/4 of it. The quarter that did not flood was in the open valley bottom, with no natural windbreak and no shelter from the north wind that came down the Powder River Valley in January with the specific purpose of testing what you had built. On the 4th day, she walked up the canyon. The canyon was not on her 40 acres. It was on the creek bottom that ran into the cliff face a 1/4 mile east, creekland, territorial, not filed on by anyone, accessible to anyone, and therefore not providing legal security, but present, available, usable. She had walked the canyon in the summer with Hannah collecting the mineral-stained stones that Hannah liked to arrange on the windowsill, and she knew the canyon the way she knew the other geography of the valley, as background, not as potential. She looked at it differently now. The canyon was a cut in the basalt cliff that the creek had been making for longer than there had been people in the Powder River country. The basalt walls rose 30 feet on the south side, 40 on the north, with the creek running between them in spring and early summer, and drying to a trickle in late summer and freezing solid in winter. The south wall was in shadow most of the day in winter. The north wall caught the winter sun from 10 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. The low-angle light that came in over the south wall rim and hit the basalt face directly for 4 hours a day on clear days. At the base of the north wall, roughly 15 feet above the dry creek bed, a ledge of harder basalt ran for 40 yards, a natural shelf where the canyon wall had eroded unevenly, leaving the harder layer in place. At the east end of the ledge, the basalt had fractured and pulled back from the cliff face, leaving a pocket in the rock, perhaps 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide, with a ceiling of solid basalt 5 feet above the ledge floor. She climbed to the ledge. The pocket in the basalt was not a cave in the dramatic sense. It was a recess, a 3-sided room with the 4th side open to the canyon. The basalt walls were rough and dark, the typical Powder River basalt that was harder than limestone and held its temperature differently. She pressed her hand against the back wall. The rock was warm, not warm in any comfortable sense, warm relative to the September air, which was 52 degrees and dropping. The back wall of the basalt pocket was warmer than 52. She held her hand against it and counted her heartbeats and felt the warmth coming from the rock, not the surface warmth of a sun-heated stone, but something deeper, the warmth of mass that had been absorbing the canyon's heat all summer and had not yet released it. She looked at the ledge beneath her feet, 12 feet wide, running back 8 feet to the pocket wall. She looked up at the overhang of basalt above the pocket, the solid ceiling that would carry snow load without the need for roof structure. She looked at the south wall of the canyon below and assessed where the winter sun would come in, the angle of the light at the winter solstice. She thought for a long time. Then she went back to the cabin and told Hannah to start packing the things that were hers by right and origin, the things that Werner had brought from Ohio, and that had never been Heinrich Brauer's by any accounting. She had 6 weeks. The first problem was the face wall. The pocket in the basalt was 3-sided and open at the front. She needed to close the front, enough to stop the wind from scavenging the heat she built into the basalt back wall, and enough to create an interior she could manage thermally, while leaving the upper portion open for smoke and maintaining a view of the canyon that would let her see weather coming. She built the face wall from the canyon's own material, the basalt cobbles and flat pieces that the creek had been sorting out of the cliff face for centuries and depositing on the ledge and on the dry creek bed below. She carried them herself, 1 trip at a time, the face wall growing from the ledge floor upward in courses of fitted basalt with clay mortar from the creek banks. Hannah helped from the second day. She was 11 and she was Werner's daughter, in the particular way of daughters who had watched their father work with his hands. And she understood mortar work and carried more per trip than Dorothea expected. They did not discuss what they were building or why. They built it. By the end of the first week, the face wall was 3 feet high. By the end of the second week, it was 5 feet, running the full 12-foot width of the pocket, solid basalt and clay, above the solid basalt of the ledge floor. At 5 feet, she stopped the full wall construction and built a lower section for the left 3 feet of the wall, 2 feet high, fitted with a flat stone door on rope hinges that swung in and could be propped or closed. This was the entry. You came in on your knees, and the door swung behind you, and the entry was low enough to limit cold air exchange when it was opened. Above the entry section, the full wall continued to the ceiling at the right side and in the center. The left upper portion, above the entry door, and to the left of the face wall's full-height center section, she left open for approximately 2 feet of height along a 2-foot width. This was the smoke gap. She had watched smoke move in the canyon, and she had chosen the side and height of the gap with care, testing it before she built past it by lighting a handful of dried grass inside the partially completed structure and watching where the smoke went. The smoke went up and left. The prevailing canyon wind came from the southwest, funneled by the canyon walls, and the gap on the upper left of the face wall put the smoke outlet on the lee side of the prevailing direction. She built the face wall to the gap dimensions she had tested and mortared the top course on both sides of the gap and left the gap open. The hearth came next. She had hauled the iron firebox from the cabin. It was not large. A simple box of 1/4-inch plate iron with 4 legs and a hinged front door. Werner's design and manufacture from Ohio, something he had made in the winter of 1851 before they left. She set it in the right rear of the pocket, against the back basalt wall, raised on 2 courses of flat basalt stones, so the fire was elevated from the floor and the heat rose against the back wall above, rather than pooling at floor level. She packed clay into the joint between the back of the iron firebox and the basalt wall, sealing the gap so that the fire's heat had nowhere to go but forward into the room or back into the stone. This was not sophisticated technique. It was the application of the obvious principle that heat moved to where it was let, and she was not letting it go backward. The sleeping platform was timber, two poplar poles she had cut on the creek bottom and hauled up the canyon path, laid on basalt block supports across the full width of the back section, elevated 18 inches above the basalt floor, covered with the bedboards from the cabin and the mattress stuffed with dried creek grass that Hannah had restuffed in September. Elevated above the floor because cold air settled, and a platform 18 inches up was measurably warmer than the floor. She knew this from the root cellar and from the common experience of sleeping lofts in Norwegian houses, which she had not lived in but had heard enough about from Werner's Norwegian neighbors to understand the principle. The door. The rope-hinged flat stone was not adequate as a permanent door. It would hold cold air out adequately enough, but it would not seal against the February wind that came down the canyon when the north wind funneled in. She built a proper door frame from poplar timber, setting it in the face wall opening with clay and basalt chips wedged into the joints, and from the cabin's spare boards she built a plank door fitted to the frame, hinged with leather hinges she cut from Werner's spare harness, sealed on three edges with clay-stuffed moss strips that she replaced as needed. The door closed flush. She tested it against the September wind, which was not the February wind, and it held. She moved into the basalt pocket on the first day of October, 6 days before Heinrich Brauer had said the hard cold usually arrived in the Powder River Canyon. Hannah came through the door on her knees and stood up inside and looked at what her mother had built. She was 11 years old, and she had a scientist's habit of looking at things longer than other people looked at things. She pressed both palms against the back basalt wall. She said, "It's warm." Dorothea said, "It has been absorbing heat all summer. It will give it back slowly." Hannah said, "How slowly?" Dorothea said, "Slowly enough. All night if the fire is right." Hannah pressed her palms harder against the wall. She said, "It feels like the stove." Dorothea said, "Not as warm as the stove, but it will be there at midnight when the stove has gone cold." Hannah moved her palms across the wall, measuring the warmth in different places. She said, "The right side is warmer." Dorothea had not noticed this. She pressed her own hand to the right side of the back wall, then the left. Hannah was correct. The right side was warmer. She thought about why. The iron firebox was in the right rear. It had been there for 3 days while she finished the door installation, with small test fires to check the smoke gap direction. The right side of the back wall had been absorbing 3 days of firebox heat. The left side had not. She said, "The firebox has been heating the right side for 3 days." Hannah said, "And the left side is still warm from summer." Dorothea said, "Yes, and the right side is warmer because of the firebox on top of the summer heat." Hannah took her palms off the wall and turned around and looked at the room. She had the quality Werner had, the ability to see a space as a system rather than a collection of parts. She said, "So the wall does 2 things. It holds the summer and it holds the fire." Dorothea said, "Yes." Hannah said, "Is that why you built here?" She said, "That is part of why." Hannah said, "What is the other part?" She said, "The other part is that this ledge is 15 feet above the creek bed, and the north wall catches the winter sun for 4 hours a day, and no one else in the valley has thought to use it." Hannah pressed her palm against the wall one more time. Then she went to arrange her things on the sleeping platform in the precise order she maintained them, the order that had survived the cabin and the move and would survive whatever came next. The first fire that Dorothea burned for the full night was the test she had been working toward since September. She built it up at 9 in the evening, hard wood at the base, the iron door closed on the firebox, the draft controlled through the ashpan opening at the bottom. She went to sleep on the platform with Hannah beside her, and the quilt pulled up, and the basalt back wall within arm's reach above the head of the platform. She woke at 2 in the morning, as she always woke at 2 in the morning. the habit of the frontier woman whose job in winter was to manage the fire, and she lay in the dark and felt the temperature of the room without moving. The fire had burned to coals. She could tell by the quality of the dim orange glow through the firebox door grate. The room was still. The canyon wind outside had come up. She could hear it above the ledge, the sound of the open country above the canyon rim. She put her hand back to the basalt wall. The wall was warm. Not as warm as 9 in the evening. Warm. Genuinely, measurably warm. Warmer than a night-cold room had any business being, the warmth of mass that had been charged all day and was slowly releasing what it had. She lay with her hand against the warm basalt at 2 in the morning, with the canyon wind outside, and she breathed the warmth of the room. And she thought about Werner telling her about Heinrich, and what it meant that the agreement was not written. And she thought about Heinrich's face across the kitchen table, and she thought, I will be here in April, and I will be here in the April after that. She slept. November proved the principle. The Powder River Canyon in November was not the Minnesota Territory's November, and it was not the Ozarks' November. It was a Mountain West November, cold by almost any measure on the planet, but specifically and characteristically cold in the way that elevation and the particular geography of River Canyon country produced. Cold that came with wind and came quickly and left without warning for a day or two before returning harder. The temperature on the coldest nights of November dropped to -18, -22, and the wind down the canyon on those nights tested everything it touched. Dorothea Schreiber's basalt pocket was not touched by the wind in the same way the open structures were touched by it. The canyon wall above and the face wall below and the pocket's 3 basalt sides meant that the wind hit the ledge and went over it. She had chosen the ledge because it was 15 feet above the canyon floor, and because the basalt overhang above the pocket extended far enough that she had tested a lit candle at the face wall opening in September, and the flame had not moved. The back wall held at 54 degrees on the coldest November mornings before the first fire. She had found a broken thermometer in Werner's tools, the glass tube intact with the mercury and scale. The wooden casing split, and she had wrapped the glass tube in cloth and placed it against the back wall each morning and read it before building the fire. The reading was consistent, 53, 54, once 56. The basalt did not change. The sky changed, the wind changed, the temperature at the canyon rim changed. The basalt did not. Karl Brauer came in November with the bundle and the look. He came twice in November, once in early month and once in late, and each time he came through the canyon path and called out before dismounting and came in and drank the coffee she made and looked at the back wall and the thermometer cloth wrapped against it and asked his questions. He was a thoughtful boy who had been made more thoughtful by the autumn. He asked about the wall and why it held warm, and she explained the basalt's thermal mass, the way she had worked it out herself, not with formal vocabulary, but with the physical reality of what the rock was doing. She said the basalt had been sitting in this canyon since before anyone could say how long, absorbing the summer's heat, and that the deeper you went into the rock, the more heat was stored, and that all winter the rock was slowly giving back what it had spent the summer taking in. He said, "It's like a battery." She looked at him. He was 17, and he had been to the school in Henriksen before his father decided school was less important than work. He said, "A galvanic battery. It stores energy and gives it back." She said, "I don't know about galvanic batteries, but yes, that is what it does." He pressed his hand to the back wall and held it there. He said, "My father's cabin. The north wall is cold in January." She said, "Yes." He said, "There is no mass in the north wall. It is timber and daub, and the cold comes through it." She said, "Yes." He said, "If you built against a hill, a south-facing hill, the hill would be behind you like this wall." She said, "That is the principle." He looked at the wall for a long time. He said, "My father should have built against the hill." She said nothing. He said, "I told him once." He said the hill was too far from the water. She said, "Water and warmth are both necessary. You choose your priorities." He looked at her and then looked away, which was a thing he had started doing in October, looking and then looking away. He said, "I'm sorry for what my father did." She said, "Your father made a practical decision." She said it without warmth and without bitterness, which was the only way to say true things that were not comfortable. He said, "It was not a fair decision." She said, "No, it was not fair." She paused. "But here I am." He looked at the back wall, the thermometer in its cloth against the basalt. He said, "And you are warmer than we are." She said, "In this particular respect, yes." He stayed longer than he had stayed in previous visits. When he left, it was past midday, and the canyon was already in shadow. December was the month she resolved the smoke problem. The smoke gap on the upper left of the face wall worked adequately in the prevailing southwest wind. In the December north wind, which came down the canyon from the open country above the canyon head, the prevailing direction reversed, and the smoke gap became an air intake rather than an exhaust. On north wind days, the smoke backed into the room, and she had to manage the firebox with a lower heat, and the door cracked rather than closed, which was uncomfortable and inefficient. She built a baffle. The baffle was a flat piece of basalt, 18 inches wide and 14 inches tall, suspended on 2 iron rods she had from Werner's smithing supplies, running horizontally above the smoke gap on the outside face of the face wall, angled at approximately 30 degrees downward from the wall face, extending outward over the gap. The angle was calculated to direct downward wind away from the gap mouth and to create a low-pressure area above the gap that encouraged draft, even when the canyon wind was from the north. She got the angle wrong the first time and had to adjust it. The second angle was better. The third, after 3 days of trial and the memory of how Werner had explained draft to her when he built the firebox, was right. On the first north wind day after the final adjustment, she lit the firebox and watched the smoke with the same dried grass test she had used in September for the gap placement. The smoke went up and out through the gap and did not reverse. She stood in the room with the smoke going properly out and felt the satisfaction of solving a problem she had been working on for 2 months. The satisfaction that was not pride exactly, but was something close to it. The feeling of a correct thing, correctly done. Hannah was watching from the sleeping platform. She said, "You fixed it?" Dorothea said, "Yes." Hannah said, "How did you know the angle?" She said, "I didn't. I tried until I found it." Hannah said, "Werner would have liked this." Dorothea said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, he would have." She paused. He would have made it in iron from the start and not had to adjust it. Hannah said, "But he would have adjusted it anyway." Dorothea said, "Yes, that is the nature of adjusting things." Hannah lay back on the platform with the specific contentment of someone who has confirmed a proposition they believed was true. Christmas came. Dorothea had not expected to find Christmas difficult. She had been managing grief since September, and she knew what it felt like and what it required, which was primarily the discipline to keep doing the work while the feeling was present. But Christmas was the day Werner had always made something, a small thing, carved or cast or constructed. Something that was not for the claim, but was for the person who received it. Every Christmas since she was 22, he had made her something, and she had not expected to feel his absence more specifically on Christmas than on any other day, and she was wrong about this. She made Hannah a comb from the split rib bone of a deer she had taken in October, smoothed with creek sand, and rubbed with tallow until it had a modest sheen. She gave it to her on Christmas morning, and Hannah held it and looked at it for a long time, and then looked at her mother and said nothing, because she understood what it had cost, and she did not make her mother explain it. Karl Brauer came on the day after Christmas with a bundle that was larger than the usual bundles, and that had in it, at the bottom under the food supplies, a small carved figure of a horse, black-painted pine, perhaps 4 inches long. There was no note. He handed her the bundle and looked at the wall and drank the coffee and rode back down the canyon. Hannah found the horse at the bottom of the bundle and held it and looked at it and then looked at her mother with the specific look of an 11-year-old who had come to a conclusion. Dorothea said nothing. She put the food away. January was the month the wall proved itself. The January cold of 1859 in the Powder River country was not the dramatic cold of a polar vortex event, but the sustained, grinding cold of a mountain winter that had been building its resolve since October and had now arrived at the settled temperature of serious intent. The January nights ran from -25 to -31. The days did not reliably rise above 0. The canyon held whatever the night had left, without the daily sun, providing the recovery that the open valley got for a few hours in the afternoon. She burned the firebox each day from 4 in the afternoon to 10 at night, 6 hours of fire. She read the back wall each morning with the thermometer before lighting the fire. The readings ran from 51 to 56, consistent through the January cold, the basalt doing exactly what she had calculated it would do, giving back each night what the previous day's fire had put in. The room temperature on January mornings before the fire was between 53 and 58 degrees. She had one visitor who was not Karl Brauer in January, a man named Douglas Pine, who had a claim 3 miles south of the canyon and who was not a bad man but was a persistent one, came to the ledge on the 8th of January and stood at the base of the canyon wall and called up. He had been calling up since November in various forms, always with food, always with the same offer wrapped in different words, and she had been declining since November in the same direct way. He called up and she looked out through the smoke gap and she said, "I am not interested, Douglas." He said, "Dorothea, it is -28, and you are alone with a child in a rock in a canyon." She said, "It is 55 degrees in this room." He was quiet. She said, "I am not interested." She did not say it unkindly. She said it with the same evenness. She said everything. He said, "The blizzard is coming." She said, "I know." He said, "Come down to my cabin when it comes." She said, "I will not need to." He stood at the canyon base for a moment more, and then he said, "I'll leave the food here." She said, "Thank you, Douglas." She said this with genuine warmth because the food was useful and refusing the food would have been foolish. He left the bundle at the base of the cliff and rode south. She sent Hannah down on the rope ladder to retrieve it. Hannah came back up with the bundle and pulled the rope ladder up and latched it against the face wall where it was kept, and she set the bundle on the table and looked at her mother. She said, "Mr. Pine is afraid for us." Dorothea said, "Yes." She said, "Are you afraid?" Dorothea said, "I am respectful of the blizzard. That is different from afraid." Hannah said, "What is the difference?" She said, "Afraid makes you want to go to someone else's cabin. Respectful makes you want to be sure yours is ready." Hannah thought about this. She said, "Is ours ready?" Dorothea looked at the face wall and the smoke baffle and the door seals and the firebox and the wood stack inside the left wall, 3 cord of hardwood she had cut and hauled up the canyon path in October and November. She looked at the back basalt wall and thought about what was in that wall. 6 months of summer heat and 4 months of daily fire and the deep temperature of the basalt hill above that had never been anything but constant. She said yes. The blizzard arrived on the evening of February 3rd. It announced itself the same way she had heard old-timers describe such events, not with drama, but with a specific change in the quality of the air, a pressure shift and a smell of ice that had nothing local in it, ice from somewhere far north that had been traveling a long time and had arrived. The temperature had been falling all day. At 4 in the afternoon, she read -14. At 6, -21. At 7, the first wind came down the canyon. The canyon configuration that had made the ledge a good location all winter now showed its one liability. The canyon ran roughly north to south, and a north wind came straight down it, funneled and accelerated by the canyon walls. The blizzard wind was a north wind. It hit the ledge at the full force of the funneled canyon effect, -21 and increasing, and it said things about the face wall and the door seals and the smoke baffle that she paid attention to. The face wall held. The basalt was heavy and well mortared, and the clay joints had dried hard through the autumn, and she had repointed them twice. The wind found no purchase. The door held. She had packed the moss seal strips tight in October and replaced them in December, and the door fit flush in its frame. The smoke baffle held. The north wind that had caused the smoke reversal in December was deflected by the angled basalt baffle, and the gap maintained its draft. She built the fire up at 7 when the blizzard began, and she kept it burning until 11, 4 hours beyond her usual 6-hour session, putting heat into the back wall against the 2 days the blizzard was going to keep her from adding more. She sat in the room with Hannah, and they listened to the wind and the creak of the basalt overhang above the pocket and the particular sound of a blizzard finding every gap in every structure for a mile in every direction and entering the ones that were not ready for it. She said, "The Mercer family." Hannah said, "What about them?" She said, "Their cabin faces north. Their woodpile is short." Hannah said, "How do you know their woodpile is short?" She said, "I saw it in November from the canyon rim. I counted what they had." Hannah looked at the fire. She said, "What will they do?" Dorothea said, "They will burn what they have, and then they will burn what they should not burn, and then they will go to the next neighbor and ask for what no one should have to ask for." Hannah said, "Should we go help them?" Dorothea said, "In the blizzard, no. After the blizzard, yes." Hannah was quiet. Then she said, "What will we give them?" Dorothea said, "What we have to spare." She said, "Do we have enough to spare?" Dorothea said, "Yes." She said it without checking the wood stack because she did not need to check it. She knew what was in the stack. 3 cord in October, reduced by 4 months of managed burning to approximately 2 cord. 2 cord was more than she needed to finish the winter. 1 cord would do it, managed the way she was managing it. She had a cord to spare. She banked the fire at 11 and lay down and slept. She woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of something she had not expected to hear over the blizzard wind. A voice, below the ledge, calling her name. She came to the face wall and looked through the smoke gap. The snow was horizontal, and the wind was at the canyon walls, and the visibility was perhaps 6 feet. Below the ledge, at the base of the cliff, a shape that was a person. She said, "Who is there?" The voice said, "Heinrich." She stood at the smoke gap with the blizzard outside, and Heinrich Brauer's voice below, and she was quiet for a long time. He said, "Dorothea, please." She lowered the rope ladder. He came up through the horizontal snow, hand over hand on the rope with the wind trying to separate him from the cliff face, and he came over the ledge, and she pulled the ladder up behind him, and he stood on the ledge, and she looked at him. He had been in the blizzard since midnight. This was visible on him. The frost was in his beard and his coat, and the particular set of a person who had been cold for longer than cold should be sustained was in his posture, the compressed survival mode that cold imposed on bodies that were managing it on reserves. She said, "Come in." He came through the door on his knees. He stood up inside, and she handed him the blanket from the foot of the platform, and he wrapped it around his shoulders, and she put the fire up, and did not speak while the heat built in the room. Anna was awake on the platform, lying still, watching. She did not speak. After 10 minutes, when the color was returning to Heinrich's face, he said, "Marta." She went to the Mercer cabin 2 days ago when she heard the blizzard warning. "The boys are with me." He paused. The cabin is leaking. The north wall, the daub is out in 3 places where the timber has moved over the winter. He paused again. The wind is through the wall. Dorothea said, "Your boys are in the cabin now." He said Karl stayed with them. Franz and Karl both. They have the fire, but the wind is through the wall, and the woodpile is... He stopped. She said, "Is what?" He said, "I did not manage it well." He said it plainly, the way you said a thing you had been sitting with for a while. "I thought we had enough. I thought I had more time to cut before the blizzard." She looked at him. He had come through a blizzard in the dark, over 2 miles of canyon trail, because the wind was through his wall, and the woodpile was short, and Karl and Franz were in the cabin with both problems. She understood exactly what had brought him here, and what it had cost him to come here, and what it meant that he had come here specifically, rather than somewhere else. She said, "How short?" He said, "A day. Maybe a day and a half at current burn rate." She said, "The blizzard runs 2 days, maybe 3. He said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Hannah was watching from the platform, had not moved. Dorothea said, "I have a cord to spare." He looked at her. She said, "You cannot move it in the blizzard. When it breaks, you take it." He said, "I will pay for it." She said, "I know you will." She said it evenly as she said things. She did not say what was also true, which was that the accounting between them was more complicated than firewood and money, and that she was not going to go through that accounting tonight with a blizzard outside and his boys in a drafty cabin on a short wood pile. He said, "The herd." She said, "Not tonight." He said, "Dorothea." She said, "Not tonight, Heinrich." She was not harsh. She was clear. "There is a blizzard. Your boys are in a cold cabin. We will talk about the herd when the blizzard is done." He was quiet. The fire built in the room, and the back basalt wall absorbed the additional heat, and the room came up to 62, 64 degrees, warmer than Dorothea usually ran it, because she had the extra fire, and because Heinrich Brauer needed the warmth the way someone needed it who had been in a blizzard for 4 hours. He fell asleep in the chair. She did not wake him. She sat with the fire through the night and maintained it with the care she had been applying to it since October, the precise management of a resource she understood in detail. At 2 in the morning, the back wall read 61 degrees. At 4, it read 57. The fire was low and the blizzard was at its worst. The wind down the canyon at a sustained velocity that she could feel in the face wall as a pressure, a weight of air against the basalt, and the face wall did not give, and the smoke gap maintained its draft, and the door was sealed and the room was 57 degrees. She pressed her hand to the back wall and held it there and listened to the blizzard. The blizzard was saying what it was saying to every structure in the Powder River Valley, the thing it said every February, the question that only some structures could answer correctly. She had built the structure that could answer it. She was here. At 6 in the morning, Hannah woke and came to sit beside her, and they sat together at the face wall, listening to the blizzard, and the back wall behind them was warm, and the fire was burning cleanly through the smoke gap, and Heinrich Brauer was asleep in the chair with the blanket around his shoulders. Hannah said quietly, "Why did he come here?" Dorothea said, "Because his cabin is not warm enough, and he knew this one was." Hannah said, "How did he know?" She said, "Karl told him." Hannah was quiet for a moment. She said, "Karl told him about the wall." Dorothea said, "Karl has been pressing his hand to the wall every time he visits since October." "Yes, I expect he told his father about the wall." Hannah looked at the sleeping man. She said, "Is he going to give back the herd?" Dorothea said, "I don't know." Hannah said, "Will you make him?" She said, "I will have the conversation when the blizzard is done." Hannah said, "And if he won't?" Dorothea looked at the back wall. She said, "Then I will build something else." Hannah looked at the wall too. She said, "This wall." She said, "This wall and whatever comes after this wall." Hannah pressed her palm against the warm basalt. She said, "It's still warm." Dorothea said, "It will be warm at noon. It will be warm tomorrow morning." Hannah said, "Because of all the fires." She said, "Because of all the fires, yes, and because of what was in the rock before we lit the first fire." The two things together. Hannah kept her palm on the wall. She said, "Werner would have liked this conversation." Dorothea said, "Yes." She said, "Would he have built this?" Dorothea thought about Werner, his quality for cattle and for construction both, the way he approached a problem with the specific combination of patience and stubbornness that was his signature, the way he would have looked at the basalt pocket and the canyon ledge and the thermometer reading on the first morning. She said he would have built it differently. He would have used iron where I used stone and timber where I used clay. It would have been more precise and taken longer to build and been slightly more uncomfortable to live in. Hannah said, "But warmer." She said, "Probably the same. The wall is the wall. What you build in front of it is less important than understanding what the wall does." The blizzard broke at noon on the 5th of February. The wind dropped, and the snow stopped, and the sky went the particular hard blue of a cleared winter sky that had nothing left to say. The temperature was -31. Heinrich Brauer woke when the wind dropped, the way people woke to silence after noise, and came to stand at the face wall and look through the smoke gap at the blue sky and the stopped snow. He said, "It's broken." She said, "Yes." He looked at the wall. He pressed his palm against it, the way Karl had always pressed his palm against it, the same gesture, and she thought, the son learned it from watching the father, except the son had learned it from watching her, and so the father was learning it from the son. He said, "The wall is still warm." She said, "It will be warm tomorrow morning." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The herd." She waited. He said, "It should have been Werner's." He paused. "And after Werner, it should have been Hannah's. I know this. I knew this in October when I said what I said across the kitchen table." He looked at the wall. "I was looking at what I could take, and I took it." He was a practical man, and he was willing to say the true thing about himself when he had spent 2 nights in the cold thinking about it. She said, "Yes." He said, "I'll draw up the paper. When we get back to the valley, the herd to Hannah managed jointly until she is of age, with my son's labor and 1/3 of the increase as we had agreed with Werner." She said, "And the cabin." He said, "The cabin is on my land." He paused. "But I have 2 sections, and I can file a correction that puts the cabin on its own 1/4 acre, deeded to you." She said, "A 1/4 acre, and the creek bottom 40 that is already mine." He said, "Yes." She said, "And this ledge." He looked at the basalt pocket, the face wall and the smoke gap, and the fire and the back wall warm after 2 days of blizzard. He said, "This ledge is not on anyone's claim." She said, "I want it on mine." He said, "Territorial land has to be filed through the—" She said, "I know how it is filed. I want it on mine." He was quiet. Then he said, "I'll help you file it when we go to the land office in the spring." She said, "Yes." She went to open the door, and Heinrich Brauer went out through it on his knees and stood on the ledge in the -31 morning and looked at the canyon and the stopped blizzard and the 2 miles of trail he had to cover to get back to his boys in the drafty cabin. He turned and looked at her in the doorway. He said, "How warm is it in there?" She said, 55 degrees. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You built it alone." She said, "Hannah helped." He looked away down the canyon and said something under his breath in German that she did not ask him to repeat because she had heard it before in Werner's voice. The same phrase Werner used when he encountered a thing done well that he had not done himself. She had not heard it in 4 months. She did not say what she felt hearing it. She said, "Go to your boys." He went down the rope ladder and crossed the frozen creek and disappeared up the North Canyon Trail. She stood on the ledge in the -31 morning and felt the warmth coming through the open door behind her, and she thought about Werner and about Heinrich's paper and about the cord of wood she was going to send with Carl when he came with the bundle next week, and about what Hannah had asked the night before. This wall, and whatever comes after this wall. She had been thinking about what came after since October. She had a creek bottom 40, and soon a quarter-acre with a cabin on it, and soon a filed claim on a basalt ledge above Crow Creek, and she had a herd that was Hannah's by right, and the skills she had spent the winter building into a knowledge that was worth having. What she built next would be the cabin on the creek bottom quarter-acre, backed against the south-facing rise above the creek, with the basalt's principle applied to a structure that was also a home, and not only a shelter. She had been thinking about what Werner would have used iron for, and where she would use stone, and what the south exposure would give her in the winter, and what the creek bottom's spring flooding required in terms of the foundation. She went back inside and closed the door. Hannah was at the back wall, her palms flat against the basalt, reading the temperature the way she had been reading it since October. She said, 54. Dorothea said, yes. Hannah said, the blizzard didn't change it. She said, the blizzard cannot change what is in the rock. Hannah kept her hands on the wall. She said, are we going to live here always? Dorothea said, not here. Something like here. Built better, with what I know now that I didn't know in September. Hannah said, here first. Dorothea said, here first. Hannah pressed harder against the warm basalt and looked at the smoke gap where the February light was coming in. Hard blue winter light, the blizzard done, and the cold at -31, and the back wall at 54 degrees. She said, Werner built the cabin on the wrong land. Dorothea said yes. She said, you built this on the right rock. She said yes. Hannah took her palms off the wall and turned and picked up the small carved horse from the sleeping platform and held it in both hands and looked at it and then at her mother and then at the wall. She said, I think Carl is coming back this week. Dorothea said, probably. Hannah said, with the bundle. She said, probably with the bundle. Hannah said, and with the look. Dorothea said nothing for a moment. Then she said, yes, probably with the look. Hannah set the horse back on the platform in its precise position and lay down and arranged herself for sleep with the satisfaction of someone whose calculations had confirmed what she already knew. The back wall held 53 degrees through the afternoon. Dorothea sat by the fire and listened to the post-blizzard silence of the Powder River Canyon and thought about the paper Heinrich Brauer was going to draw up, and about Werner's voice in 4 months' absence, and about the small carved horse on the sleeping platform, and about the conversation she had not had yet with Carl about what it meant that he had come every week with the bundle and the look, and about the claim she was going to file on the basalt ledge above Crow Creek, and about the house she was going to build on the creek bottom, 40 in the spring. The basalt wall gave its warmth into the room. The canyon was still. She had built here and here had held. Whatever came next would be built by someone who knew what this wall was worth, which was a different kind of person than the woman who had walked into the canyon in September with Werner's thermometer and Werner's tools, and the understanding that the basalt had been warm under her palm and that she had 6 weeks before winter. 6 weeks. She had built what 6 weeks could build, and the blizzard had come, and she was here. That was enough for now. That was, for now, everything.